Welcome, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Climate Vault's CDR webinar series on terrestrial carbon dioxide removal solutions. I'm Bryn Esterly, CDR Projects Manager here at Climate Vault. As some context for our audience before we get started, carbon dioxide removal projects have an increasingly important role to play in combating the effects of climate change. In order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and ensure a stable climate for future generations, simply reducing our current emissions isn't going to be enough. We also need to remove historical emissions that are already in the atmosphere, and we need to do so at gigaton scale. So this is where CDR comes into play. We need a diverse set of scalable CDR solutions to enable organizations to remove historical carbon from the atmosphere and neutralize those other hard-to-abate emissions. At Climate Vault, we view CDR solutions across three different pathways: oceanic, terrestrial, and technological. In today's session, we'll focus on terrestrial solutions that are leveraging the natural processes and capabilities of plants, soil, and microorganisms to sequester and store carbon out of the atmosphere. With me today are three terrestrial project developers who are among the first 10 eligible project developers to apply for Climate Vault's grant funding program to support new and innovative CDR projects. Please join me in welcoming Jabu Madlala, founder and CEO at SmartAgrIoT and chairperson of SmartAgrIoT Rural Development; Josh Silverman, CEO and founder at Windfall Bio; and Ning Zeng, co-founder and head of science at Carbon Lockdown. Thank you all for being here today. To kick things off, I'd like to have you each share a little bit about your organizations and also about the project that you currently have under consideration for Climate Vault's grant award. Ning, let's start with you. Can you tell us more about Carbon Lockdown and your project to remove carbon?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Ning Zeng. I'm the co-founder and head of science at Carbon Lockdown. And Carbon Lockdown is a public benefit company that I founded a little more than a year ago. And it stems out of university research for the last 15 years. And the technology we work on is called wood vault, where we bury sustainably sourced woody biomass in a shallow geological layer, typically a few meters below ground, that keeps the oxygen out and prevent it from decomposing. Because the wood source is sustainable, so the overall balance is a net carbon sink.
Excellent, thank you, Ning. Jabu, would you go next, please?
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity. Yes, my name is Jabu Madlala, and the founder and CEO of SmartAgrIoT. Why I mentioned the two organizations is because SmartAgrIoT is a carbon development company. And while SmartAgrIoT Rural Development is what you call a non-profit that works with local landowners, as we are focused on assisting and working with and using the land as a soil, as a carbon storage. So for us to have access to the land, we've got to have a relationship with the landowners. So for us, it's very important that we develop and separate the two. SmartAgrIoT, on the other hand, uses AI-based technologies, including satellite, combining it with the land and in monitoring and managing the stored carbon in the soil, and also ensuring that there's no leakages, ensuring that there's permanence. So we use the combination of technology, and we use also the soil sequestration, and so on. So that's why we have sort of the two organizations, but that is our business model, because the two organizations provides two different services. Thank you.
So thank you, Jabu. Josh, would you please go next?
Yeah, thanks, Bryn. Yes, my name is Josh Silverman, CEO and founder of Windfall Bio, which we founded about a year ago, but it's based off of technology we've been developing over basically the last decade or so. And we use naturally occurring organisms, microorganisms from the soil that actually capture methane directly out of the air. So a little bit different. We focus on methane as the source of carbon from the atmosphere that we want to capture. And part of that is because methane has a much larger impact than CO2 over a short period of time. But also, more importantly, methane is a source of energy. So when we actually capture that methane, the methane provides the energy for the capture, and it actually promotes the growth of the organism, which allows for a much more efficient process for capturing. It's a self-sustaining process because the methane is actually the food and the energy source for the microorganisms that are eating it. And these organisms are able to basically live in the soil or other types of structures, and they can eat methane at atmospheric concentrations and immediately pull that carbon out of the atmosphere, put it into the soil to drive healthier soils, healthier microbiomes. And also we focus very much on nitrogen fixing organisms at the same time. So not only are these organisms taking carbon out of the atmosphere, they're putting that carbon and nitrogen into the soil, making healthier soils and healthier environments for people that are deploying our technology. So.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction, Josh. And as you mentioned, that I wanted to reiterate, your project is unique in the sense that it does focus on methane capture and removal. So it's a bit different from the perspective of which greenhouse gas is being removed. But it's worth noting for our audience that when we talk about methane and carbon dioxide interchangeably, or we can do so interchangeably using the concept of carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e, as is often denoted. So while methane is less abundant in the atmosphere compared to carbon dioxide, it is a much more powerful greenhouse gas, as you said yourself, in terms of its proportional ability to trap heat in the atmosphere. And therefore, it's a super important area of focus when we talk about combating climate change. So thank you all, each of you, for those great introductions. I'd love to move next to our first set of questions, which focus on the state of terrestrial CDR solutions. And as we can see just from the differences among your projects, the terrestrial pathway encompasses a really diverse range of CDR approaches, which is exciting. So I'd like to just take a step back, though, for a moment from the project specifics and help our audience better understand the challenges and the opportunities facing solutions in the terrestrial space overall. So Ning, this first question will go to you. What unique opportunities do you see that terrestrial solutions offer in solving the global carbon challenge?
Yes. So a little bit a big picture from the carbon cycle point of view. The terrestrial biosphere each year absorbs 6 times more carbon than what's emitted from burning fossil fuel. So there's a large capacity in capturing CO2 out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, which is a result of billions of evolution for free. So that is really a great advantage about using a biosphere as a carbon captor. Of course, the challenge is nature is in balance. So pretty much all that carbon captured each year goes back into the atmosphere and by respiration and decomposition. And nature also has demonstrated how you could accumulate carbon over time. Indeed, that is how fossil fuel is formed. It's a small leakage from what we call the fast carbon cycle, put it into longer term, in the case of coal, for example, millions of years long. And so the potential is large. And then the challenge is how to intervene with human intervention so it can accelerate this process. So traditionally, terrestrial carbon sequestration is about growing forest conservation. These are all very important because human land use change have really released a lot of carbon, hundreds of gigaton over the last few thousand years. If we can restore part of that back into its original state, that would be able to absorb a lot of carbon. And then the limitation with this approach is, of course, the permanency issue. A forest, when it matures, the carbon sink pretty much saturates, and then it's vulnerable for to fire and other potential threats. So over recent years, scientists and practitioners have been looking at other approaches that can lead to more durable and long-term and sustained carbon sequestration with the terrestrial biosphere. So here, there is where what we call durable long-term carbon sequestration. So there are several methods. One of them is called a large umbrella. It's called BICRS, biomass carbon removal and storage. So a key is really storage. How do you keep that carbon there? And so just use the example, and our company has been working on the wood vault, is to keep the captured carbon in the form of woody biomass and keep it away from all the decomposers that can eat it. So to do this, of course, there are multiple pathways one can do it. One can keep oxygen out, or make it dry or cold condition, because these are the conditions that will prevent decomposers like fungi, insects from attacking the biomass. So we have a lot of scientific evidence it is feasible. And so several groups, organizations, companies are working on such ideas to extend the natural lifetime of the biomass capture from the atmosphere. So I'm very excited about the potential of making these different pathways work.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ning. And Josh, I'd love to hear from you as well. What are your thoughts, some of your thoughts on the challenges and opportunities in the terrestrial pathway?
So yeah, there's certainly a couple of good points to build on Ning's point. So the first, in terms of the benefit of terrestrial pathways in biology for climate, right now, biology really is the only technology we know that can scale to global scale to actually impact climate. And the reason for that is when we talk about intensification for like other types of direct air capture, they're very energy intensive, they're very capital intensive, they're very expensive. And when we think about like, how do you actually intensify biology, like nobody talks about an 800 degrees Celsius tree or a 100 atmosphere pressure tree. You just plant more trees, right? And the output of a tree, it grows, it pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere, and the output of that is more trees. So you have positive feedback loops that work in ways that are useful and helpful to climate. So biology sort of is inherently scalable to sizes and scales that we need to be able to impact climate in a positive way. And it's something that can happen in our lifetimes, and we've seen happen in our lifetimes. That being said, again, we focus on methane approaches. And when we talk about durability, some of the problems of CO2, like you said, the re-release and durability of CO2 solutions, forests burning down, like these are obviously real problems that biology has. But by focusing on methane, we can really take care of those durability problems, because thermodynamics tells you methane is the high energy form of carbon. If we consume that methane and capture it, it doesn't go back. It doesn't reverse. And so any methane that we can pull out of the atmosphere has instantaneously and permanently removed up to 86 equivalent tons of CO2 over just a 20-year time period. If you look at that instantaneous one, it's actually about 120 tons equivalent of CO2 warming out of the atmosphere. And while right now methane it has gone up significantly more in the atmosphere than CO2, but it's causing roughly 30 to 50% of the actual physical warming of the planet today from methane in the atmosphere. And yet, many people talk about carbon removal, CO2 removal interchangeably, but right now, carbon dioxide removal strategies have been funded to like 95% of the funding going into the atmosphere right now. So there's a big disconnect where, more than 30% of the actual warming is happening from methane, and yet we're not really looking at that as a solution. So the ability for very large, cheap efficient scaling globally and having much bigger short-term impacts by focusing on methane without any kind of long-term risk of re-emission of that carbon in the form of methane. We think that's again, don't get me wrong, we absolutely need to be doing both carbon dioxide and methane side by side, so this is not an either or, but we're very much thinking methane gives us a much faster path into having big impacts and using the natural organisms in the soil to do that.
Thanks, Josh. And one follow-up question. So when we think about methane versus carbon dioxide, do they face the similar challenges are there similar, are the needs similar in terms of overcoming the challenges faced by methane emissions versus carbon dioxide, or are there some unique differences between the two?
I mean, there are certainly some similarities, and both of them are at relatively low concentration in the atmosphere. So you need to be able to find ways to again scale up and deal with large volumes of air in at a cost-effective way, which is again why biology works so well, because we can scale horizontally as opposed to trying to intensify. And energy cost is a massive factor for moving all that air. So there's that. I think the biggest difference between the two is CO2 is the end product of combustion. It's the lowest energy state of carbon. So anything you do to CO2 requires energy, which means it's whether you're going to capture it, transform it, modify it, you need a source of energy to drive that process, which means it's always going to be expensive. It's always going to cost money. It's always going to require some extra outside source of energy to drive that. And the difference here really is methane brings energy to the table, right? If I have enough methane in a concentrated amount today, I can sell it into a pipeline. I can burn it for electricity. Methane brings all the energy you need fundamentally to actually capture it out of the atmosphere, as long as you can harness that energy. And the organisms that we use and have evolved, they've actually been on the planet longer than plants. And longer than trees. So these are microorganisms that eat that methane as their sole source of carbon energy. And they don't need sunlight. They don't need any other source of energy, because they can use the energy from that methane to drive its own capture. So it, in theory, is a much more self-sustainable and cost-effective process, because you don't have to put other energy in. But again, that being said, it shouldn't be an either or. We should be doing both, because we need to pull both methane and CO2 out of the atmosphere if we want to address the climate change strategies or challenges that we're having today.
Great, thank you, Josh. And Jabu, I'd love to hear from you as well. What do you see as the unique opportunities for the terrestrial pathway? Is there anything that you feel sets these types of projects apart from projects in other pathways, such as technological or oceanic? Love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for that question. I just want to concur with Josh there. About methane. And we're also in the nature-based solutions, and so on. And it's not just, by the way, about methane and carbon dioxide, but I want to also add another gas, the nitrous oxide, which is another problematic gas, that we work with within those three gases. So, and if you look at nitrous oxide and you look at methane, but all of those gases still needs to be converted, including carbon dioxide, needs to be converted into carbon and stored. And those are the three gases that we are involved. So in what we are doing, we're transitioning and creating and introducing new practices, new ways of doing things using the land, and then monitoring those new ways and all these new techniques, new approaches that we introduce to the landowners, and we make sure that the result is either going to be the reduction of nitrous oxide, it's going to be the reduction of methane, it's going to be the reduction of carbon dioxide. And then once it's converted, and then it's all stored in the soil. And that's why because we believe that, I think, in the parts of the world where I am, just we have just over 4 million smallholder farmers. These are private farmers. And in Africa, in total, we have over 35 million smallholder farmers. These are all, they own millions and millions of hectares. And I believe that this land here, we can use as a source of storage. And because we are nature-based, for us, we're involved in various regenerative practices that we introduce, whether that's afforestation as new trees, whether it's agroforestry, which is also has a benefit for the communities, very poor communities, and because we engage in these poor communities, but we want to create sustainable solutions as we reduce emissions, as we introduce these new practices, whether it's agriculture or agroforestry and so on. So the minute you introduce the agroforestry, for example, let's say we're going to go for silver pasture and so on, which is the livestock. And the minute to minute you talk livestock, you're talking methane gas. So you're talking both methane and you're talking carbon dioxide. So we find ourselves that we have to, and the minute you're talking agriculture, you're also talking nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, because all these farmers have to use fertilizer. And we need to teach them what is the best fertilizer they need to use, and then they cannot just use chemical fertilizer, which can have a negative effect. And that's why I said earlier on that it's important that for us, it's about all these three gases. It's not one gas over the other. At some point, all these gases, but obviously the focus is carbon dioxide. But the other gases also come into effect. So I want to think that I think there are a lot of opportunities. And I agree with with Josh in terms of yes, the funding has gone into and the focus on the carbon dioxide reduction, and I think there has to be more also emphasis on looking at other gases like methane, like nitrous oxide, because those are as deadly, and all of them combined, we just have to tackle all of them. There has to be an increase in funding to also those gases here. So yes, I think there are massive opportunities. Currently, we have more landowners than the available funding. We have more landowners willing to come on board and than the available funding, and so which could translate into over 30 years. Which could translate into a lot of emissions and so on, and carbon that can be stored in the soil. So yeah, so I think in a nutshell, yes, obviously there are challenges, and the challenges is we have several methodologies, we have several we are dealing with different registries out there, and so on, and there's verification and validation processes. It's not a short process. It's a long process from start to finish. It's not a quick buck. And I think accuracy, and also when you're dealing with funders, funders want to make sure that the carbon credits are justifiable. In other words, you cannot say 10 when it's actually 6. And others they'll be paying for 10. So, there are also those challenges that we need to make sure that I think we're dealing with. I think many countries, we still have to go through the process of approving and legislating, if I use the word, this is voluntary carbon market, but legislating the processes of reducing. I think here in South Africa, we are very fortunate that the act was passed in Parliament in 2019. So so that process and those who are participating in the reducing emissions are credited, with the carbon, with the tax, through the tax system of the country. So, and I think many countries are following suit, around the world, and which will really benefit many. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jabu. Thank you all for your comments. And Jabu, you raised an interesting point as well when you mentioned the standards and methodologies that exist. It is true that it's not enough to simply remove carbon from the atmosphere. We also need to make sure that the carbon removal is being achieved in a sustainable way, in an equitable manner, and it's not causing undue harm to the communities and ecosystems in which these projects are taking place. So I'd love for us next to focus on the topic of social and environmental equity in the development, implementation, and scaling of terrestrial CDR projects. I think that's a really important factor to consider. So I'd love to hear from each of you, what kinds of social and environmental factors do terrestrial solutions need to consider when you're determining site locations or when you're implementing your projects? Josh, I'd love to hear from you first.
Yeah, no, that's a great segue, because I really did want to kind of double click on Jabu's point around the small stakeholders. I mean, they're and the small, self-sustaining farms, because when we talk a lot about these sort of climate solutions, and people talk about these multi-story stainless steel fans and huge sequestration things, like that's not something that a small farmer can do. And if it's an expensive piece of technology and it requires a lot of upfront capex, it's just never going to scale to the size that we want in the time frame that we want. But small farmers represent huge quantities of, well, one, people, but more importantly, land, and the ability to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So we need to find solutions that, one, are cheap. So they have to be cheap up front, because no farmer wants to spend a lot of money to put a lot of capex in place, but it also has to drive value for that farmer. And if you can do that, then it's something that many people can now implement in parallel and create benefits for themselves on the farm. And going back to what I said before, I think one of the main things that we focus on is using nitrogen fixing bacteria. So not only are we pulling carbon out of the air with methane, we can actually use the energy from that methane to also put nitrogen into the soil. And we can make those soils healthier by putting both carbon and nitrogen, by improving the diversity of the microbiome of the soil, making the soil healthier. The farmer, not only can they do things that are good for the climate, but they're doing things that are actually good for their actual farm and improving their own productivity. And by aligning those two things, and to Jabu's point, like nitrous oxide is a big problem, chemical fertilizers, which are absolutely, again, necessary for producing food. So again, don't get me wrong, but if we can find better sources of nitrogen that don't have the same nitrous oxide, then that can also be a climate win. So again, those are tools that we're putting into the hands of the farmers, because our fertilizers do not produce nearly as much nitrous oxide as chemical fertilizers. And so you can incentivize each individual farmer to do what's right for their farm. And it also happens to be well aligned with making the climate and the health of the planet better. And I think it's finding those solutions that align the incentives in the right way. That's how we actually move forward and scale to global scale and impact. And I think nature-based solutions is how you do that. I mean, you're not going to do that with anything that requires stainless steel. I think, and maybe that's a controversial opinion, but that's my opinion. Stainless steel is not the way to solve this. It's got to be nature.
Josh, Ning, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. What kinds of social and environmental factors do you consider, or do you think terrestrial solutions need to think about?
Yeah, first I echo Jabu and Josh's point. The fact that biosphere is distributed, it's owned and operated, run by so many different people around the world, makes really different from large-scale factory type of operation. So this is also a great opportunity to offer a new economic possibility for example, declining rural areas and foresters and farmers. And we really need to involve these communities. In my mind, terrestrial biosphere-based methods actually have the advantage over industrial scale operations in that instead of for example, industrial case, often you have like an obvious negative impact on the community. And while nature-based plus some engineering methods actually have the potential to do exactly the opposite. It's just like new opportunities for everybody. And specifically, for example, what Jabu is talking about in terms of all these small farmers in developing countries. And one additional aspect is if we can do durable carbon sequestration, we add an additional management component to existing agroforestry and so on. That will make the carbon sequestration potential sustained. Instead of keeping those a few 100 tons per hectare of carbon there, kind of keep worrying about it, right? And now we can actually manage and harvest the wood and use it for carbon sequestration and other, of course, good purpose products and so on. Then we have the potential to really take advantage of the terrestrial biosphere productivity I mentioned earlier, which is huge, and benefit locals and the climate at the same time.
Thank you, Ning. And I think you raised an important point as well. This particularly stuck with me, which was having the right people at the table, which stakeholders you're engaging with. And so I'd love to hear from each of you, who are the stakeholders that generally need to be at the community or at the table, excuse me. What are the stakeholders that need to be at the table when we're talking about implementing these types of projects? Jabu, do you have thoughts on the types of stakeholders that should be engaged?
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, from our experience, we have an onboarding process, that the onboarding process, in other words, how do you identify the location? How do you identify the community? How do you identify the area, the site, and how do you engage with the community, explaining what we're trying to do. As you know very well, I may have not mentioned that a part of our offering, is that we don't expect the community to be academically qualified or to have all this education that is needed. We understand that we are in an environment where the community is not educated, the community doesn't have the skills, the community doesn't have access to the technologies. And so what we bring on the table, we bring a package. We bring a package of resources from scientists to agronomists to and so on. And so when you engage with, you need to speak at the level that the community will understand, and go down and translate the engagement. So one of the things, and governance obviously is a key part in this whole thing, to say what sort of governance are we looking at? When I'm just talking a stakeholder as a specific looking at the community, which is one among many stakeholders, because we have several stakeholders. Community is one major stakeholder. Why the community is one major stakeholder is because the community or the farmers, they bring the land to say, hey, we're not educated, but I own 10,000 hectares. Please, I haven't used this 10,000 hectares for the last ever since. If it can reduce, emissions, please, I would like to volunteer so that this land can be utilized over 30 years to reduce emissions. That's what we're talking about. This person has not been to school. This person doesn't speak English or French or a language like that. They speak another indigenous language, but they have the very important asset, the land. So, so the stakeholder engagement for us is very key, because what it does, we have to then develop what you call a stakeholder plan, or a stakeholder management plan, which is a governing document which defines the relationship, obviously, that leads into signing of the lease agreements with the landowners, and also, by the way, getting into the carbon benefit sharing. Deciding how are the carbon credits going to be shared over a period. And then what that does is it really motivates, because the landowner begins to see the whole initiatives. They begin to own the asset, to say, wow, this is my asset. And they begin to protect the asset, because by protecting the assets, they're making sure that they're a watchdog. They're a watchdog. They make sure that there's nobody who will start the fires that could destroy everything. There's nobody who will do something funny in the land where we are working, where we are storing carbon, by the way, because we are storing carbon on the land. So they become, they feel they own the whole thing. So that's why it's important that the stakeholder, the major stakeholder, which is the community, and obviously there are other stakeholders that has to be part of this governance. Part of this governance structure here that needs to be established. But obviously, the community becomes the major. And again, when you talk of the economic and the social and the environment benefits for the communities, they are massive, because the earnings that they from the carbon credits that they will earn, they can reinvest back into the community, and also and then in that way they'll be able to buy more tractors. If they need tractors, they'll be able to do the things that they need to do with that revenue. And obviously jobs are created, and a lot of job skills are developed. Capacity building is being, because we have to have a capacity building program as part of these things to make sure that the community is empowered, and so on. So yes, there are a lot of social and environmental in terms of by behaving this way, you're changing the behavior of the community. So you're making sure there's permanence, you're making sure that there's less leakage, you're making sure that there's additionality and all those good things, and that happens. And there are core benefits, obviously, and in the environment. So so the stakeholder is a most crucial, and it's something that must be done at the beginning, not in the middle, not towards the end. It must be done at the beginning of the project, when the project is initiated. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jabu. And that's an excellent point. This should be done right at the beginning. It shouldn't be an afterthought. Josh, I'd love to hear from you. How do you approach stakeholder engagement? Do you have best practices that you might be able to share with us on how to engage with key stakeholders?
Yeah, I don't know if I have best practices per se, but so first I would, I think, again, just reiterate everything Jabu said. I think it's all very accurate. Educating the individual stakeholders, the individual deployments, small farmers who absolutely want to do things that are good for the climate, but they need to be businesses first. And we use this line a lot. The first definition of a sustainable business is one that's profitable, right? If a business is not making money, it's not going to be around. And the same thing with a farm is a business, right? If the farmer is not able to make money, if they're not able to grow food, if they're not able to feed their families and their communities, they're not going to be around very long. So it's fine to say, like, well, this is great for the environment, but it's got to be good for the farmer and the individual deployer first and foremost, because if you don't cross that hurdle, you don't get anywhere further. And I think making sure that we have that value proposition and you can explain it very clearly to those stakeholders why this is going to make sense for them. And then, by the way, it's also good for climate as the extra added benefit. Or if you can't say that, it's not going to go anywhere. I think from our standpoint, in terms of also when we talk about credits, I think maybe the biggest challenge, and I'll use this as my soapbox, of being able to put methane side by side with carbon dioxide. Again, coming back to methane is causing 30 to 50% of the actual physical warming of the planet today. And yet again, only a tiny fraction of climate funding is going towards methane solutions. And even today, we hear over and over again, well, we need to take carbon out of the atmosphere, carbon removal, et cetera. But when you dig in, most of it is really only talking about carbon dioxide, which again is great. We need to remove carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but nitrous oxide, methane, these gases are major contributors. And most importantly, they're major contributors over very short timescales. So if our goal is prevent warming of the atmosphere by 2030, 2040, like not going over 1.5 degrees by 2050, we need to look at short-term gases. It doesn't help to have a 100-year window of calculations and climate credits and all that when we only have 20 years to actually make an active choice. So and in the 1980s, when these first protocols were put together, like, sure, it makes sense. Like, oh, this is a 100-year problem. Our grandchildren, we can kick this down the road, and we can take these very long windows, and we have plenty of time to work it out. That situation has dramatically changed, if it was ever true, which it probably wasn't. But at least now, I think we can definitely say we need to look at things that will have dramatic impacts to the climate immediately, and we need to prioritize those solutions before the long-term approaches. Again, not saying it's either or, but if we don't deal with short-term gases and we don't deal with short-term warming, we're not going to be around to deal with the 100-year windows and timeframes.
Thank you. And Ning, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Any additional remarks you'd like to add or comments in terms of best practices for engaging with stakeholders, or who you consider when you approach stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, I think this is really critically important, given that land is always owned by somebody or some organization. So the first thing is really a landowner when you talk about terrestrial solutions. Make sure they support it and benefit from it. Then there's a whole connected from local soil conservation district to forest management associations, then to the government agencies that are in charge of safeguarding the natural resources and environmental groups. And so we need to engage all these potential stakeholders to make sure to get their support. And on the other hand, it's actually, in most cases, they are all supportive because of the co-benefits of, climate, as well as, like, for example, give a specific example in the America West with all the fires region across the forest. One big reason the forest is choked with fuel loads, and the Forest Service has estimated that there will be about 0.5 to 2 gigaton CO2 per year equivalent they need to thin in the next 10 years. So to approach the communities and the government agencies about the different terrestrial CDR approaches that could potentially help to solve this kind of problem while sequestering carbon. So this sort of co-benefit story is very important.
Thank you, Ning, and thank you all for your thoughts on social environmental equity. I think we could easily spend an entire hour or just one webinar talking about social environmental equity. So thank you all for your thoughts. I do want to ask kind of a forward-looking question here to wrap up our discussion. I'd love to hear, where do each of you see the terrestrial CDR space when you look out 5-10 years from now? Jabu, I'd love to hear your thoughts first.
I think where I see it, obviously, it's really striking a balance between the technology and nature-based. And I think there are pros and cons, in nature and technology, because the technology, on one hand, it's got its time frame in terms of development, manufacturing, and so on, and deployment, and the cost can be exorbitant. So the time to market, the time to get into the market can take longer, but it also offers a lot of benefits because once you start scaling it and so on, you can store more, it can capture more carbon dioxide and so on. So yes, those are. On the other hand, we have the situation where you've got nature and you've got the land that is there available. You've got low-hanging fruits, I call it. You've got low-hanging fruits, and that's catch those low-hanging fruits, which is and implement using these nature-based solutions, and the land is there. It doesn't require a lot of funding compared to the technology, and the monitoring and the management tools, AI-based tools are available. They're in the market. Registries have now, in their methodologies, approved the use of satellites or Earth observation and so on, and to monitor and the land and so on, to monitor the change in the soil. So that is a low-hanging fruit to me. And potentially, obviously, it's got also a challenge in terms of you need to make sure that all those permanent additionality and all those good things, they happen and so on, and the risk are managed and so on. And because you are, once you disturb the soil, then you're going back to square one, and so on. So that's why I always refer to as it's about improving and increasing and transitioning the landowners from A to B, and making sure that they do the right things, and you teach them the right things that they need to do. And they are part of the whole thing, they are part of the process. And they feel it's like you're buying a house and, wow, this is my house. And, you feel the ownership. So you need to make sure that they feel they own this, and nobody must touch it and disturb it, and because they make money from it over time, So yes, so I think yes, there are pros and cons, but as I said, both technology or nature-based, they are good solutions, and they are practical. But it depends on the funding. How are they? Who is the funder? How is it going to be funded? Can you wait 3 years? Or you are ready to do it within a short period of time, and also coming up with supportive validation and verification processes and so on, because at the end of the day, the captured carbon dioxide has to be validated and verified. Thank you.
Excellent points. Thank you, Jabu. Josh, closing comments. What are your thoughts? Where do you see the terrestrial space 5-10 years from now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, and again, I'm biased. I'm a biochemist by training, so I'm very much biased in favor of biology. But when we look at what technologies have been validated to actually have impacts on climate at global scale, I mean, it really is just biological solutions, and nature is, again, because of its distributed nature, is able to scale and grow in ways that can affect climate, and can do it in a cost-effective way, and things like that. And so biology is really good at creating these positive feedback loops, and we need to be able to leverage that in our favor, as opposed to right now, I think we're many of these positive feedback loops are going in the wrong direction and driving warming. But if we can harness that in the right way, I think we have the best possible opportunity to have real impacts on climate in our lifetimes. So again, I'm very biased on this one, but I do think biology and terrestrial solutions are the way to go, and within and they are already one of the largest segments for voluntary carbon credits and offsets and impacts on climate through tree planting efforts and all the things that we're talking about here. So these are viable, these are technologically viable today, economically viable today, and align the incentives of stakeholders in the right way. So I definitely think we'll see a lot more of these solutions in practice, and I think we should.
Well, thanks, Josh, for those inspiring thoughts. Ning, what are your thoughts? Where's the terrestrial space 5-10 years from now?
I'm bullish for the reasons, fundamental reasons Josh just talked about. I think the best way, the most scalable way and low-cost way of doing carbon sequestration is actually to take advantage of what nature has already been doing, and add some engineering, different innovations, management to it to enhance that natural carbon sink. And let me give an example that combines the kind of forest practice Jabu talks about. For example, in the Amazon, over the last 50 years, close to 1 million kilometers square of forests have been cut, which has contributed to the CO2 increase in the atmosphere. And if we can reforest that 1 million kilometers square, of course, in reality, we won't be able to do all, but let's say a significant fraction of that. And then add management practice, such as using wood vaults to sustainably harvest and store that carbon. That alone on that piece of land will be able to sequester 1 gigaton CO2 per year. So when you combine all these different approaches together, take advantage of the biosphere, I think, just throw out some numbers, I think in 5 years, we should be able to get many megaton scale. And in 10 years, we have hope to get to 1 gigaton per year, sustainably scale. And of course, provided a lot of issues that need to be resolved, from funding to governance, MRV, and community co-benefits. But I think it is really possible to quickly scale up this pathway of CDR.
Awesome, thank you. And with that, I think we should wrap on that inspiring high note. So thank you, Ning, Jabu, and Josh for participating in this webinar on terrestrial CDR solutions. I'd also like to wish each of you the best of luck with Climate Vault's RFP application review process, which, as you know, is still ongoing, and wish you well in your carbon removal endeavors, and methane removal endeavors, I should say. The work you're doing is really crucial, and we appreciate you taking time to share your perspectives and experience. And to our audience, to find out more about Climate Vault's RFP for innovative CDR solutions, and to learn how our model can help your organization reduce and remove its carbon footprint in a transparent and verifiable manner, check us out at climatevault.com and through the links included in this webinar. Please also check out the rest of our CDR webinar series, which features applicants from the oceanic and technological CDR pathways. Once again, I'm Bryn Esterly, CDR Projects Manager at Climate Vault, here to help make serious climate action your reality.